Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking all things bobber fishing. Now I actually have some really cool footage from like 11 and a half months ago or so with Brosdahl, and we were chasing down some ice out perch, and that's a really cool bite that's going to be happening real soon, kind of just depending on where you live here in the ice belt. But anyway, we have a bunch of juicy tips that'll help you catch more fish on bobbers, whether it's perch, whether it's walleyes, anything in between. And with that said, first things first, we're gonna start off with some perch catching action. Oh, I'll catch 8. Oh.
All right. I love it when they bulldog. Oh yeah. Oh boy, that was heavy. Oh, that's heavy. Oh, beautiful fish. That makes it worth it. Ice out perch. Wow. I was just eating a sandwich and the bobber went down. They're liking that pink today. That pink firefly. A little waxy. We'll let that one go. Oh yeah.
There we go.
Oh, let me swing that one up. Oh. Those are the proverbial football. Look at that thing. Beautiful fish. And now I'm enjoying them. I like seeing how big they are. But when they're full of eggs like that, I'd rather not take them. Just love catching them. What a beautiful fish. But if you want to eat them, just grab some males. Even though I can't seem to catch any small ones right now. Let that one go.
Try to show it off here. Look, even I can catch one too.
You could see, besides the milking here, that this is a male. The belly's flat, and the thing is with them is they look skinnier, but they actually have more meat. So that's the harvestable fish right there. Nice male. We'll let him go do his deal. And they're starting to milk, so they make a mess. Good job, Nick. He brought the first male in here.
Sneak in the frame here. There we go. This one's got some rough fin.
Looks like a rooster fish. I feel thumping. Oh, come on. Oh, they're so heavy this time of year. Oh, wow. I'm light. That's a gigantic perch right there. Jeez, that one's got to be pushing 2 pounds. Look at the size of that one. Big old belly.
All right, now let's get into some of that juicy bobber fishing tips and tactics that I promised in the beginning of the video. Bro's gonna share some of his strategies on how he utilizes bobbers to catch more fish.
One thing with bobbers I found is they're key to presenting your bait to the level of the fish. So you want to be able to throw it in there depending on your action and work it through fast or let it sit. It all depends on how aggressive the fish are. If they're sitting there and you know they are, you see them in your electronics, then you can let it soak. But for the most part, you're bringing it in there, you're setting it up so it's in front of their face the whole time, and you're going to get more strikes. And with these light bite bobbers, they got a brass grommet which keeps your knot from going through, and there's not going to get hung up on paint, so you get the same quality flow line management with that brass grommet on the tip of the bobber. Brightness is very important. I like the color of these light bite bobbers. And then you weight it yourself. I like using smaller weights, smaller split shot, and just getting the right kind of buoyancy so that it's just sticking up high enough to see, but easy for the fish to pull down. A small swivel that's out of the way. Fluorocarbon. On windy days I'll put a split shot between there and my jig that I have below. And then bobbers, you want to be able to you want to have them float but not too big, so you pick a smaller bobber and that works for the task. If you have heavier bait or you're in heavy wind, then you can go bigger, but typically here's what the bobbers look like. I love the color. It's really bright, real flashy. Brass grommet, and that's the light bite bobber from Northland. And this is a classic shape, kind of egg shape, so it's buoyant, it holds. These will be what I'm using for walleyes, and I'll have a swivel, maybe 3 sinkers scattered on the line, or even 1 bullet sinker if you're fishing in weeds, down to a really sharp small fireball jig head, you know, a 16th ounce, to a shiner or to a leech. Works really well. And I mess around with night crawlers, a whole night crawler on a jig, sometimes around opener. Gets the walleyes to open up a little more.
Now obviously when you're bobber fishing, the componentry is very important. Whether you have a plain hook, a jig, you're talking about the swivels. Northland has these really cool new balsa bobbers which work great. You need a bobber stop, but one thing that's very important and kind of like underappreciated is the type of line you're using. So Brian is gonna break down his line setup a little bit right now.
When I'm slip bobbering, you know, most of my line is going to be around that 10-pound test, 8 to 10 pound, and I like to use braid, or a good round braid like Sunline I use as a braid. Works really well, and then you want it to be able to flow through, and because of that brass grommet, it's instead of having just paint with a hole chipped through it, it just flows really nice and doesn't get hung up. Once in a while I'll use a heavier monofilament with bobbers if I'm fishing in really thick weeds. Braid is thin, so this is a 2-pound diameter, and it's going to cut into the weed. Then sometimes you have to snap it off because you don't want to lift anchor and go where the fish are and scare them out of there. So that's when I'll use a heavy mono when I'm fishing it. But the leader below is fluorocarbon, because fluorocarbon has a better sink rate, and we're fishing straight up and down, so I'll use fluorocarbon. So for a walleye setup, I'll have 8 or 10 pound top, and then go a little less on the bottom. In case you get snagged, you don't lose your bobber and you're not. You can snap it off right here and get all this back, so you can easily tie in another leader. So if you're using 10 pound here, you want to use 6 or 8 pound underneath. And then for panfish, pretty much the same, because 10 is real thin. And then I'll have 5-pound leader, like this is 5 pound right here. Works really well for panfish. They have binocular vision, they can see things that are really micro, so make sure to go light line on the panfish.
So I think one of the biggest questions that I ask myself when I'm out fishing, especially if I'm marking fish, I know there's fish in the area, it's kind of like, what is the best presentation to catch these fish? Should I be throwing a jig? Should I be soaking a bobber? Should I be pulling crankbaits, casting crankbaits, you name it? And when it comes to bobber fishing, there's certain situations where it really shines, and Bro is gonna break down those situations right now.
Bobbers are nice because you can jig through an area, but you can stop and let your bait sit in front of them. And when the fish are biting and aggressive, then I'll just throw a jig through like this, no bobber, and just keep it elevated and hop it through, and the fish will slam it. Same with a thumper head, which is a jig with a spinner on the back, pitching it out and catching them. But when the fish are, water's cold, the fish are moving slow, you want to give them a chance to catch up to it, and that's when I'm using a bobber, or to hold it in a specific area. You can't get too close to them, the water's clear, so you can pitch a bobber in that spot. It's covering a spot and a depth. So depth and spot covered by a bobber. If you don't need that, just pitch a jig.
So there are a ton of different options when it comes to the business end of the rig. Some people like to run plain hooks, but Brian is gonna share a little bit about why he likes to use jigs, specifically jigs with shorter shanks.
Throughout the year, I've had some phenomenal bobber bites for walleyes, and I love using small fireball jig heads. You can get fireball jig heads in all the colors, all the match to hatch colors in. So bubble gum, you could have green, you could have a fire tiger, and then have a big leech on there with the bobber rig, so you're dropping it in the zone. And there's areas where walleyes are 4 to 6 feet off the bottom, sometimes 8 feet off the bottom, and you could adjust your bobber and put it right there. So for walleyes that are off the bottom, it's a great way of putting the bait right in front of their face. And you know, for the most part, that leech really moves. But sometimes that little fireball jig head with that color, and not too big, just a little one, works really well. And a short hook with a leech is good. I don't like a lot of hardware. When you're using a leech, you don't want a long shank sitting there and then a nose hooked leech. You want a fireball jig, short shank with a good gap in the leech, and then throw that out there. Works really well. Or a 1 or 2 hooked night crawler cut in half, works really well. If you're double hooking a shiner, then I'll use a long shank. But if I want the shiner to be alive, or the chub or the red tail just nose hooked, then I'm gonna use a fireball. Just don't want too much hardware hanging off the, you don't want a long shank, you want to use a short shank. Slip bobber fishing, that's one of my best things, and we do it all the time. And the nice thing about a jig versus a hook is the bobber jig falls right into place right now. There's no waiting, and it holds it, kind of pins it into their zone.
Next up, Brian is going to share what he would deem to be the biggest mistake that he sees anglers make when they bust out the bobbers.
One of the biggest mistakes I see people making with a slip bobbers is having a leader that's too short in clear water. They'll have a leader this long, and so that fish can see all this hardware falling down in front of them. And I'll have maybe a bullet sinker on when I'm fishing for walleyes. I like a longer leader and get that hardware up above them. A split shot's not going to scare a fish placed in different areas. Sometimes I'll have split shots spread out on my line like that, really far apart. It's great for casting. It's got a positive sink rate, and it's not going to spook them as much. But for the most part, longer leaders, 1.5 to 3 feet, very important. And 3 feet on the ultra spooky bites. You're in gin clear water, zebra mussel water. Get that stuff away. The bait itself will fall, the weight of the bait. But make sure to try, you know, a small fireball jig just to weight it down. And sometimes no hardware, just straight up a knot, a bobber, and then a jig. Especially in ultra spooky areas, I don't want a split shot. I don't want a swivel. I just want that jig down there by the fish's nose. Maybe you're going to be using a purple tiger fireball pad print jig and a leech, or shiner or red tail. The key times are when it counts, and you can get in depth with a bobber, and you can go basic with a bobber. It depends, because all you're doing is putting the bait where you need to have it at all times.
Now, one bobber fishing strategy that's been around for quite some time, it's very effective, is power corking or speed corking or whatever you want to call it. There's like 6 different names, but Brian is going to share a little bit about how he executes that strategy.
You know, in the summertime, when you're looking for walleyes and you're using a slip bobber, and you're cruising around and you find the walleyes, if they're on side imaging and you're pitching out there, that's one thing. But if you're going over the fish, I do like 2D sonar or down imaging, because then you know the fish is right there. And I'll drop a bobber behind the boat, and we call it speed corking for the last 20 years. And it's fast, get it down there, but your bait is at the level of the fish, and you can see on your graph how far you need to put it. And so you can line it up and make sure it's right there and drop it right on the fish. And I always err to the point of being a little bit up than down, because they'll rise up a lot faster than dropping down. If it's close, it won't matter. But so, you know, just be ready. And when you see them, drop it on them. And if you got a couple of different bobbers there, and let's say the fish is a little bit to the right or left, it's going to drop right by him. But for the most part, a fish will swim 10 feet to grab a bait. But if you could drop it right in their face, it makes a big difference. So, you know, speed corking has been a popular thing on Mille Lacs and throughout the whole area. You know, there's been people who've done it for maybe 20, 30 years, or maybe longer than that even. They just didn't give it as a tip.
So there are a lot of cool bobber bites throughout the course of the year, and you got to see some of the perch catching action in the very beginning of this video. And before we wrap this video up, Brian is gonna share a little bit more about that particular bite and where he finds perch just after ice out.
Well, it's ice out, and we tried back in a bay, and the fish weren't there, so I went back to the main lake, and look at that one. Look at that. Wow. And the fish are laying here in the weed stubble. This is where there was a cabbage bed, and they retreated from the cold weather. So big perch like this will move into weed beds or in shallow canals or rivers, but now they're retreating back. I'm gonna let it go because it's full of eggs. There you go. And if the males will have a flat belly, those are the ones you can keep if you want a meal. But they've retreated out of the river, so we're catching them here on the weed bed, kind of a neck down. And you know, if you're looking for ice out perch, find weed stubble, and that's all you need. But you also need temperature. The water's 41.6, and it's 38 to 40 everywhere else. So that little bit of a bump in water temp, making a big difference.
Well, that's about all we have for you in this video. It is kind of sort of spring, late winter, whatever you want to call it, but the seasons are changing, and we're gonna have some cool open water bites coming soon. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something, make sure to hit that little red subscribe button down below, so we have a lot more content coming this spring. Buckle up, stay tight, buckle up, and we'll see you in the next video.